Good afternoon. Welcome to this FCC Club Lunch, the FCC in Chongqing, a visual history. My name is Lee Williamson. I'm the current president of the Foreign Correspondents Club, Hong Kong. Now, the FCC's April wall exhibition features the photography downstairs on the Van Ness wall of Melville Jacoby, an American freelance journalist, United Press stringer, and foreign correspondent for Time and Life magazines who covered the Second World War in China, what is now present-day Vietnam, as well as the Philippines. Melville Jacoby lived and worked in wartime Chongqing, modern-day Chongqing, of course, covering the war, the nationalist government, and a changing China, documenting his experiences in the early 1940s in writings and photographs. What he didn't know at the time was that Jacoby was also documenting something else, the origins of this club. He was a member of the Chungking Press Hostel, which is a precursor to the modern-day FCC Hong Kong. In 2024, author, historian, and journalist Bill Lascher published A Danger Shared, a journalist's glimpses of a continent at war, which is a collection of Jacoby's photographs and letters. In this talk, we're going to discuss the extraordinary life of journalist Melville Jacoby, 1940s Chongqing, and of course, the origins of our fair club. Before we do that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Bill Lascher.
Thanks for the introduction.
So, Bill, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you flying into Hong Kong for this exhibition and for this talk. Welcome to Hong Kong and to the FCC.
Thank you for having me.
First off, simple question. Who was Melville Jacoby?
Well, let's start by hearing from him.
We're going to hear from Melville.
This is Mel Jacoby speaking from Chungking. The past few days have been hard ones here in the Chinese capital. Nearly 1,000 Japanese planes have bombed the city and outskirts, and we've been under alarm for nearly 100 hours. But despite intensive raids, damage has been comparatively light, and casualties are still believed to be low. However, a number of bomb shelters have received direct hits. One large shelter was hit a few hours ago with incendiary bombs landing at the entrance and burning many people to death inside. Go ahead, Chungking.
That's wrong. I'm just going to go hit pause.
Oh, yeah. So what we just heard was a dispatch from Melville.
Yeah.
Tell us who he was and what he was doing.
Apologies for the mistake. I just realized that I do have to hit play and turn the sound up. Sorry about the disruption. There we go.
Speaking from Chongqing. The past few days have been hard ones here in the Chinese capital. Nearly 1,000 Japanese planes have bombed the city and outskirts.
I think if we can cut the audio, please. Just cut the audio, but keep the screen down. Thank you.
My apologies. I had thought it wasn't going to cycle, and of course it cycled. Anyhow, the question was, who was Mel Jacoby?
Yes, please.
And why was he in Chongqing? So, at the point that this report is happening, Mel is one of the foremost American war correspondents in covering the war in China. At least I should say he's one of this group of war correspondents that has made this story of what at that point is a 4-year-old war between China and Japan at least more important news in the United States. He was 24 years old at the time you heard from him, a correspondent for NBC in that report, and of course Times China bureau chief. But what he really was a man who came to China first as an exchange student, learned the importance of China and Asia and international relations across the Pacific to the United States where he was from. He's a young war correspondent and a member of this incredible, vibrant, bonded, tight, and hardworking communities of journalists who lived, worked, and socialized together as they covered this extremely dire moment in world history that unfortunately is understood now and was certainly understood at the time by audiences, sometimes like even audiences here in Asia, but especially audiences in the United States. He was someone who felt a strong importance of this idea of bridging that gap and getting the war here as much recognition, which at that point had killed millions of people, and by the time that the US entered the war had killed something like 14 million people. But getting people in his home country to understand these implications that I just mentioned.
And how did you end up with these materials, Bill? You have a personal connection to Melville.
Yes, I do. So Melville Jacoby's cousin, Peggy, was my grandmother. And when I was about 23 years old, starting my own career as a journalist, looking at what I wanted to do, I had grown up wanting to be not a war correspondent, I'd grown up wanting to be a foreign correspondent. Never ended up doing that, but she knew that that was what I was interested in. She was slimming down her possessions, clearing some stuff out of one house as she moved, and she gave me a typewriter, Corona 4, portable by those standards of that day. It said, "This belonged to your cousin, the war correspondent." And I thought, my cousin, the war correspondent. I thought, that's strange. I'm in my 20s. I never heard of this cousin. And she proceeds to tell me about Melville Jacoby, this man that she adored, that the entire family adored, and that for a brief moment in the early 1940s had been even a household name, one might say, because of his role at the time. And over the mid-aughts, and over the next 10 years or so, she began to unfold this tale of this journalist that I came to know as Mel, and it came to be the subject of first a book that I wrote, and then about him, and then this book, using his photography, showing the work they did, and so I could do more to depict what she'd done. She ended up not just with a typewriter, but it's letters, these photos that you see on the slideshow and in the book and around the bar, and thousands of pages of letters and other ephemera.
Can you paint a bit of a picture of Chongqing at that time? In this room, there'll be different levels of knowledge of the Sino-Japanese War, of Chongqing, what was happening there, of the nationalist government. Can you give us a kind of Cliff Notes, if you will, version of what Melville was arriving into when he arrived in Chongqing just after Christmas 1939?
Yeah, it was, I'm going to probably fall into cliches, but it was a place that was hectic and lively and hopeful and painful and tragic and energetic and broken. It was a place of contrasts, a place of extremes. Most importantly, though, it was the new capital of wartime China, of at least free China. Of course, there was a puppet government in Nanjing that the Japanese controlled, or at least influenced, but really controlled. And of course, over the first years of the war, the government moved further and further inland from Nanjing, eventually to this mountainous city, not a backwater at the time, but not the huge metropolis it is now, because it was somewhat remote to the coast, which the Japanese controlled. It was fairly well protected. The center of the city was on a peninsula between two rivers, mountainous in the surrounding area, often foggy, which made bombings difficult, but of course not impossible, because in the time Mel Jacoby was there, I think he experienced something like 167 bombing raids. This was a city that anytime the Japanese had an opportunity, clear skies, this is a city where the people loved a cloudy day, even though, and fortunately, Chungking is often foggy and often cloudy, loved a rainy day. Constantly bombed, full of structures made out of bamboo and paper walls and anything that could be put up in a hurry and rebuilt in a hurry. It was a city teeming with people that worked for the government, so teeming with dialects from all over China, as well as local Sichuanese dialects. It was a place where there was extreme poverty and people that were the most powerful people, both in China and from places around the world that had come to be there. There was a place where a great amount of struggle happened, and for a moment it was also a place of very brief, very tenuous, but still real cooperation between the communists and the Kuomintang. So it was a place that I consider very singular in world history, And I came to learn a place that somehow drew people like Mel Jacoby and these reporters who occupied the press hostel back again and again, despite the discomfort they experienced there, despite the tragic conditions, and despite the hard work they had to do to live there.
And in this city of extremes, of challenges, of opportunities, of the constant threat of air raids, what were conditions like for journalists working in Chongqing, and what role did the press hostel play in supporting journalists who were living in that city that you just described?
Well, it's important to understand who built the press hostel, why it was there, and the role it played, because there is, of course, a complicating role in that. The press hostel was built by the Kuomintang's Ministry of Information. It was paid for by H.H. Kung, who at the time was the richest man in China. So it was a place where the Kuomintang could somewhat control the message. They had offices there for the ministry, but they also provided journalists with, a certain amount of workspace, and it was a place that operated a broadcasting radio station for propaganda. At first, in fact, Mel, when he was first hired, was hired to be an English language broadcaster for XGOY, which was a shortwave radio station meant to broadcast the news to US and other Western audiences. And he was there partially to kind of shape up what they were doing. He replaced Theodore H. White, who became his best friend, and who he would later replace as China correspondent for Time. But the conditions were, this is the press hostel actually, right here, actually right after one of the air raids on these photos. It was drafty, it was cold, each of those doors was a room, there was a separate place where they would dine, there were extra dorms made. They'd have to, if they wanted baths, they'd have to get one of the local staff, the boys mainly, to go and get water and fill up a tub and heat it up. There wasn't much food in terms of there wasn't much Western food at all, obviously it was very expensive. In terms of reporting conditions though, they could freelance. I mean, not everyone who lived there was working for the propaganda ministry or, in that propaganda role. Mel had parts of it, which he struggled with. I mean, he in his correspondence, he's very clear that he doesn't love that, but it's a way to get there for him. And he ends up leaving actually after 8 months because of his frustrations, both with that and the way management happened.
And there's a period of time where he's freelancing for US newspapers and also still working for the Kuomintang's PR machine, right?
Precisely. He started really briefly in Shanghai when he became a reporter after, he had been an exchange student in Guangzhou, then went back to the States to finish his degree, and came back in Shanghai and then made the right connections. He was freelancing at the time for whatever he could get. And in fact, in those letters that I have in my grandmother, you see this development of him as a reporter and that effort that we all know who are journalists of trying to pitch something, not knowing where to pitch it, knowing it's not paying anything and you don't have time to work on it. But he's working for, some of his first stories are for the weekly news magazine that the San Francisco Chronicle did, called This World or The World. Not exactly sure, but I have some clippings from it over there. I just can't remember off the top of my head right now. He's trying to get in the UP, like you mentioned. He's taken some pictures that appear in random, things like sort of slightly seedy magazines, not seedy, but sort of not quite men's magazines, but that sort of weird level of like magazines like Click and Look, anywhere that will publish photography, But also regular newspapers. There's a newspaper called PM that he submits this really extensive look at Chungking under fire, some of his photography. So he's both a photographer and a writer. He's trying to get his pictures published. He ends up learning a lot of photography from Carl Neidens, who is one of his he meets as one of his Time magazine colleagues. But he's a writer. He's doing these broadcasts. Another thing he has to deal with is the fact that the radio station, which is first on the grounds of this XGOY facility, or this ministry facility in central Chongqing, and gets moved to Shopping Ba out on the west of the Yuzhong Peninsula. He has to get up very early in the morning to go make these broadcasts. He has to edit sometimes really poorly written copy, either for himself or for other broadcasters. He's trying to balance that, and he's struggling with that. How can I be seen as a independent journalist while I'm also putting across a certain message? although he's able to maintain, a certain rapport with sort of all perspectives. But I think that's for everyone else to judge his independence.
Quick plug for our panel tomorrow on journalism ethics, by the way. I'm sure our panel would have some interesting things to say about the context in which Mel Jacoby was working at that time. I think there are still some places available tomorrow. So talking about his perspective, you said even before he landed in Chongqing, he was very interested in how Western newspapers were covering the war, the Sino-Japanese War, versus the war in Europe, right, as well as the treatment of China versus the treatment of Japan in the Western press. He even wrote an undergraduate thesis, you mentioned before, at Stanford, comparing these two things.
Yeah.
So what was his perspective? What did he think before he landed, and then when he landed? What was his perspective on how the press was treating the war in Asia versus the war in Europe?
Well, I should make a correction. It was a master's thesis. He did a strange, I'm being a little pedantic, but he had done a 5-year situation where he stayed at Stanford and earned his master's degree while he wrote this thesis. So he was exploring, the comparative coverage of conditions in Japan and China as they appeared in U.S. newspapers, and I'm probably going to oversimplify it. Specifically California papers. Not only did he go to Stanford, he was from Southern California. So he picked a selective sampling of these papers and how they cover things. And it's been a while since I've read it, but I believe he also had some examples of coverage that were domestic to China and Japan. But the primary message that he focused on was the flattening coverage of the war and of Asia as this exotic, the sort of tropes you might expect to hear of this exotic, savage place where these people are, at each other's throats. And it's really informed by an experience he had as an exchange student. Again, he had been at Lingnan University, which is, of course, now here in Hong Kong, but at the time was on the campus of what is now Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou. And he traveled here a lot, traveled to Guilin and other places in southwestern China, and then ended up in the summer of 1937 taking a trip through the rest of China, through central China into northern China, and out through Beijing on his way to Japan. And it was in the middle of that trip that the war broke out, and he witnessed a little bit of it, he experienced a little bit of it, and when he got home that fall, or at the end of that summer, all these reporters came to him and a couple other people on the steamer that he came in on and asked, what was the war like? And what was this terrible, terrible war like, And he told them what he saw, and he realized that it was nothing like what was appearing in print when he actually looked at the newspapers that were here. So recognizing that disconnect, that sort of difference between what he actually witnessed, how people were experiencing the war. Both, maybe it wasn't as serious as it was, but also in terms of the implications of the war for the West, and particularly California, and how it was being minimized in this now very clear upcoming war in Europe. He really became devoted to building understanding of Asia and building understanding specifically of China. He became president of an international club at Stanford to try to develop more of that understanding and also more cooperation between international students at Stanford. And he developed that interest in returning and getting to China as soon as he could after he got his master's degree, so he could provide better reporting. He wanted to make sure, for example, that it was reporters in Asia who were providing the stories that were covering that war, and not editors at newsrooms in California or Washington or New York deciding what was happening in that war just based on these reports that they got from stringers.
When he landed in Chongqing and he found a community of people at the press hostel who shared the same values and the same desire to tell the story of what was actually happening on the ground. Not in this romanticized, exoticized language, but the actual true story of the horror that was unfolding before them. Talk a little bit more, please, about the press hostel and about that community of like-minded war correspondents that was built there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that community was everything to him and to many of these reporters. It's very important to me because I've always been interested in so-called third places, and that's exactly what the press hostel was. Well, maybe it was a little different because the third place is, of course, a place you go outside of work and home to connect with people, and it was their work and home. But it provided that dynamic impact of networking, of understanding, of exchange of ideas, and teamwork, of course, or not teamwork, but as reporting conditions got worse, as things got frustrated, as things got frustrating, access started to get limited by the Guomindang government, as officials started to censor them more, those frustrations built among these reporters. And they started to think, especially when Mel returned in 1941, he had gone home for a few months. He had actually left XGOY in the summer of 1940, fed up with the way that internal politics were disrupting the management of that radio station I mentioned and other things. And also so he could report from the brewing intervention of the Japanese in what is now Vietnam. But when he returned, he found the conditions had worsened and that it was harder to report stories, harder to get the stories that you reported printed, and harder to get access to the officials you knew you should have access to and that you developed relationships with, and often for various bureaucratic reasons. And there are major stories that were worth covering locally, like there was a scene that went through of that bodies piled on the stairs, which was partially the result of a mismanaged air raid shelter in Chongqing. So these reporters decided to get together and issue a memorandum to, they sent it to Hollington Dong, who was their sort of connection with the rest of the government, the information minister, and used it to complain of all these issues. The number of signatories on that were press hostel residents or just reporters working in Chongqing, and many of those signatories would end up becoming the foundational members of the FCC. This is in the summer of 1941, and the FCC would be formed in May of 1943.
This memo, or Melville's reporting for Time on the existence of this memo and the co-signatories is one of the centerpieces of the exhibition downstairs. If you haven't had a chance to see it, do check it out. And as you say, this is kind of the genesis from going from the press hostel, which was kind of bought and paid for by the Kuomintang government, to the FCC, which later became the FCC Hong Kong. I want to read you one part of Melville's reporting for Time when he's talking about this memo that the journalist wrote to Kuomintang. But aside from living conditions, correspondents found themselves battling something worse than a hard bed and no whiskey. The censorship, since the end of last year, gradually tightened until the messages were always hacked to pieces, their guts gone by the time they reached the cable. It's interesting that these co-signatories who went on to be the first board and the first president of the FCC, they kind of came together around an issue, petitioning the government to petition them on censorship, and there's also complaints about surveillance as well as access, right?
Yeah, there's every complaint you could imagine if you're living in that kind of situation. And I think Mel, in particular, he was really sensitive to that after experiences he had just had in French Indochina in Hanoi, where the Japanese and the Vichy-controlled French administration had been surveilling him and other reporters there, and had been at one point arresting him because of what they deemed to be taking pictures of something that he shouldn't have been taking pictures of. And so I think returning to Chungking to see some of these same issues showing up in this country that was supposed to be fighting this kind of regime that would be so I would, forgetting the word, there's one regime fighting fascism. There is similar impacts from this government. Excuse me, I think you all get my drift, that he was frustrated to see what was happening there, and he could see the frustration on these friends he had made and experience it. And I think, again, like that thing about material being hacked to bits, he was also experiencing that in terms of what, again, like I said, what he saw in the coverage back home. And this, not just that coverage that he saw when he was a student, but coverage when he saw stories that had been written by him that he had submitted to other publications and how they appeared in print when he went back home and starting to hear about that. And this would become an ongoing issue, of course, for journalists in China, including Mel's best friend, Teddy White, and Mel's eventual wife, Annalee Jacoby, who ended up experiencing a great deal of censorship in 1943 and 1944, and of course into the publication of their book, Thunder Out of China. So he was very sensitive to these issues. And I think that when he returned, it's very clear, not just from that memo or that letter. That memo comes from a dispatch Mel sent to his editors at time, but in his correspondence back home, that things were different in 1941 from how they had been in 1940. And if you read the reporters who went back in 1942 and 1943, you see those conditions worsen and worsen and worsen.
I think, obviously, the FCC has changed so much in 80 years, but I think that idea of the FCC as a third place was there then and remains now. That idea of journalists coming together around a common mission to support press freedom and to support journalists, to facilitate high-quality journalism, was there then and is here now in the club. Mm-hmm. And also, the importance placed on good alcohol was there then and is very much there now as well. Tell us about the first president and the first board of the FCC, who were the co-signatories of this memo. There was the first president, Brooks Atkinson.
Brooks Atkinson. I don't believe I could speak off the top of my head too accurately about the exact members, because it's one of these issues that was in flux for a while. People had sort of lost that thread, and only just last week that I happened to find a news article in the Shanghai Evening Post and Mercury that actually talked about the opening of the Foreign Correspondents Club that May, as well as there's a directory, an annual directory of Chungking from 1943 that lists it on the site of the press hostel. And Atkinson, of course, as the first president, but there were a number of other people, Spencer Musa, Teddy White. There was there were some other, I remember there was a Russian reporter. I know his first name was Vadim, but I can't remember his last name at the moment. So that information is there. It's just a little shrouded. I understand that there's some information that people would like to find out a little to kind of connect that thread a little bit more. It'd be great to find the original bylaws or something like that. But these are all reporters that knew one another, and many of whom were signatories of that first memo. I do know that from just having compared it. I'm just having a hard time remembering the precise names at the moment.
I'm going to ask us a couple more questions, then I'm going to open it up to the floor, unusually early, because I think this is a topic that a lot of people are going to want to ask questions of Mr. Lascher on. So do start thinking about your questions that you want to ask Bill. Talking about those connections from the press hostel to the FCC in Hong Kong, tell us about Liao Tianping, or Papa Liao, who is somebody who also featured in the exhibition downstairs on the Van Ness wall. He was a tea boy at the Chongqing press hostel, and later a bar manager at the FCC Hong Kong. Tell us about, decades later, tell us about his extraordinary life and the thread of Papa Liao that also runs through the history.
Well, I think that's something that, of course, we don't do a good enough job of discussing when we talk about this kind of history. We don't talk about the people who make something like the press hostel possible as much as we should. They show up. This boy is not actually at the press hostel, I should add, though, but this was at Mel's former school. But anyhow, these people who like I said earlier, they heat the water for the baths of the people who work. They cook the food. They run documents. There's, some of the letters describe a bit of frustration in the sense of, the one where Mel talks about someone who's working at the press house or blows his nose on a manuscript, But he also talks about the hard work they do and other people do. And so I didn't even know about Mr. Lau until about 10 years ago when I wrote my first book about Mel. And I came here to the Foreign Correspondents Club for the first time, or I was talking with Carsten Schael, who put up the wall exhibit with me and curated the images in it. And he saw a picture that I had among some of my pictures. He's like, that looks familiar to this former bar manager. And there was this boy, probably in his teens at the time, standing in front of the hostel, smiling. And we pulled out an old image from a copy of the correspondent of Mr. Lau at his retirement and realized it's the same person, because the name had not been identified in Mel's pictures, at least in that image at that time. And there's a picture from there, another picture of some group shots of staff there with him in it. And what that really tells us is that, for better or for worse, there was some commitment, at least, to that community of staff. I don't have enough information about how many staffers overall ended up coming with the members of the club as it moved first to Shanghai and then here. But clearly there was at least that commitment to him, and he became such a crucial piece of this community. I, unfortunately, do not have as much knowledge of the press hostel and the FCC. I keep calling this place the press hostel, excuse me, after 1942, because that's sort of where my involvement with Mel's story ends, or my understanding of it, and his story kind of ends. So my understanding is a little less deep once you get outside the formation of the club and you get to its decades, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, on to today. So, but I do know that he was, such an integral piece of this organization, and being able to realize that he was a presence in 1940 and 1941 all the way through, is really outstanding.
You mentioned the importance of the staff that support the journalists and the members of the press hostels and the FCC. That is very much still a huge part of what this place is about. We had an annual staff dinner last month, and we're able to celebrate so many people who've been here for 20 years, 25 years, 30, 35 years, 40 years. That kind of long service and the importance of the staff. The 100+ staff we have here, I think, has been part of what the FCC is about and remains a part of it. You mentioned Carsten Schael. I want to give a particularly big thank you and a shout out to all the work and everything that Carsten has done. Can you join me in giving a round of applause to Carsten? Carsten Schael is a member of the FCC Wall Committee and also an FCC archivist, as you mentioned, his knowledge of the FCC, and he's told me fascinating stories of staff moving from Shanghai. Of course, the club relocated from Chongqing to Shanghai and down to Hong Kong in 1949, carrying FCC-branded pots and pans and silverware down to Hong Kong with them. I encourage you to ask Carsten plenty of questions after this talk as well about the FCC as well as Bill. But again, thank you, Carsten, for everything you've done to curate this exhibition along with Bill and to set up this talk. You mentioned to me before when we spoke on the phone, there was allegedly a FCC member expelled for libeling another member. I'm wondering, gossip in the FCC is also something, it seems, that is a stream that connects 1943 to 2025. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was new to me as of last week. It was Friday, maybe a week ago, actually, a week and a half, 2 weeks now. I was doing one of those end of the day, just let's find a little bit more stuff out before I take my trip to Hong Kong, see if there's anything I can add, and I did a little search through some stuff I was looking at, and some stories from some of its, about one of its original members. Again, I'm forgetting his name because it was a lot of information in my head, and it's a new story to me, but apparently he had claimed, shows up in some coverage in the AP and in Editor and Publisher, and I think even an issue of the newsletter from the Overseas Press Club, who was talking about, club members and how they were, all sorts of gossip, club members who were having intimate relations with one another, or intimate relations with officials, or with other people, or drinking too much, or this and that. And I forget where that expressed itself in terms of where that, I think it was in a, if I understand correctly, it was in a book that this reporter had written. And they were frustrated by that obviously it wasn't cleared, and they voted as an organization to expel him for this alleged libel. Although, I will say, I've seen some recordings, some letters from both. I know there's one letter from Mel that showed up in another reporter's archives, where you're able to see a little bit more candid of an experience of what's happening at the press hostel than what you might see in his letters home to his parents, although he's fairly candid in those. And he's talking about one reporter in particular who was very prolific in his encounters with young men and and police officers in the area, and they generally, it's implied in terms of sounds that were heard. Remember, this is a very thin structure at which people lived, thin walls. The surveillance wasn't just surveillance from the government, it was everyone knew what everyone else was doing. And there was the usual drama there. And remember, most of these reporters are in their mid-20s. Mel first got to the press hostel when he was 23 years old, and he was there when he was 24, and he'd already become, by the time he was about his 25th birthday, he was Times Far East bureau chief. They called, the Asia desk was the Far East, So these are all very professional people, very accomplished people, but also young. And I'm also not saying that older people don't get involved in scandals and inappropriate things, but that's the kind of thing that happened. And if at the time the club members are living at this facility, they're going to be experiencing things like this. So that's the nature of it. Again, this was something new to me that I have not researched in great depth, but it's clearly one of the early dramas of the club.
Some things never change. You mentioned Melville's 25th birthday. For those who may not yet have seen the exhibition fully downstairs, can you tell us why his story ends so abruptly quite soon after the Chungking experience?
So Mel's birthday, September 11th, 1941 was when he turned 25, and days after that, or maybe a week after that, a couple weeks, a woman comes to town, Annalie Whitmore at the time. He's encouraged her to come to work for United China Relief. They've already kind of had a flirtation going, and he proposes as soon as she gets to Chongqing, and they get married. Or no, he proposes. Then he gets assigned to travel to be that time Far East bureau chief, and that means he's being relocated to Manila, where everyone knew the war between the U.S. and Japan was likely to start, and likely to start soon. So they needed a reporter there to manage that coverage. He's transferred along with Carl and Shelley Meidens. Carl is a photographer. Shelley is, the researcher and reporter. Annalie, because she's just committed to this new job, decides to stay and fulfill her commitment until the very last moment she can finally come in November of that year. It actually lands in Manila the day that the Japanese fleet sets sail for what will eventually be the attacks on Pearl Harbor. And that day, she gets off the Pan Am Clipper, a couple pandas in tow that are a donation to the US government, which they will have to watch on their very brief honeymoon next to Lake Taal. While
more things never change. Journalists having to cover a lot of panda news.
Yeah, there's some great stories about those pandas and the future adventures they had, and how they were acquired. But anyway, it's a couple of weeks after that day that, again, they're married that day. They're married right there as soon as she goes off the plane, with reporters as their witnesses. Carl and Shelley Meidens and another Time reporter named Ellen Mitchie. They both get to work when Pearl Harbor happened. Of course, it's December 7th in Pearl Harbor. It's December 8th here. That same day, Manila's attacked, and they get a call telling them of this. Mel doesn't believe it. They go to cover it. Annalie gets assignments for both helping Mel, but also she gets assignments writing a number of really great stories for Liberty magazine. And they spend the next 3 weeks covering those first stages of the war in the Philippines until Manila is declared an open city, and they realize they have to make a decision. If they stay and risk that opportunity of, the possibility of being in a Japanese internment camp, or run but not knowing where they can go, because at that point Japan has surrounded Luzon and have, the Bay's Mine, everything is dangerous. But they realize because of some of Mel's run-ins with the Japanese and with the puppet government, he's probably not safe if he stays. So Mel, Annalie, and 3 other reporters decide to leave. Carl Meidens and his wife decide to stay, and they end up our intern, and ultimately repatriated in a prisoner exchange. And Mel and Annalie leave the last boat at midnight. They find a blockade runner through some connections. Docks are literally blowing up around them. There's this really amazing report that Annalie gives when she's back in the States about everything that had happened. leap onto this freighter, its engines turning, go out in the mine-strewn bay at night, end up on Corregidor, the fortified island where the US forces are staging part of their resistance, of course the rest on Bataan. And they report there and provide some of the first pictures of Bataan and Corregidor, some of the first stories that are coming out of there, until finally it's clear that the US is gonna have to surrender these places as well. And they're told that by General MacArthur, who is extremely desirous of having this story of the lack of resources that the American forces in the Far East have been given at that point. He wants that story publicized. I'm actually somewhat contrarian to some of the stories about his role in escaping himself, but we can get into that another day. Mel and Annalee flee first to Cebu after this island-to-island trip, sailing by day and sailing by night, hiding out by day. Cebu's not conquered yet, so they're there for a few weeks until a Japanese destroyer is coming to attack Cebu, and they end up getting on a blockade runner, sailing another few weeks through Japanese waters until they ultimately end up in Australia. The point being, Mel experiences this tremendous amount of danger while providing some of the first coverage firsthand that the US is seeing of the war. Everything seems great. He gets a deal to write a book. He starts writing the book on that escape. In fact, it's in Cebu where Mel picks up the typewriter that was ultimately given to me because he had ditched all his other materials for that escape because they could only take what they could carry with them. Actually, the night before he fled, he and Carl Meiden burned all their notes in a furnace of their hotel in Manila. And he's in Australia reporting for a couple of weeks, so is Annalee, and they're accredited war correspondents. Till one day he decides to take a trip to Northern Australia to see the U.S. air defenses being prepared for Northern Australia and the very likely possibility that Japan will attack. It's the defense of Darwin, and he's accompanied by a general named Harold H. George, who had been the head of the air defenses of the U.S. resistance on Corregidor. And they pick up a British hitchhiker, an officer at one of the air bases they stop at to refuel. That guy needs to go to a place called Batchelor Airfield. They stop, land, and are talking about the defenses when a American fighter on the tarmac nearby, doing some training operations, runs out of control, slips across the runway, runs into the transport that they've just arrived at. Its propeller is sheared off and dances, as one of the reports says, dances across the runway into Mel. And obviously he's killed instantly. He's 25 years old. And so is Harold George dies in the same accident, another person's injured. And so he dies having accomplished something by 25 years old that many of us probably can't claim to accomplish in our entire lives. I certainly hadn't. And he's lauded as a hero, as a, quote, soldier of the press. So that's the end of the story.
What an extraordinary life, and so extraordinarily told by you, Bill. We're so grateful for this conversation. I'm now going to open it up to the floor for questions. Please do identify yourself before you ask your question. A microphone will come to you. Who has a question? The gentleman over there was fastest finger first.
Mark Michelson, fascinating. I want to ask you a little bit about the working journalists. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is something you looked at as well. What was their access to the Kuomintang and to the American military and others in Chongqing then? I mean, was it reasonably good? Did they come to what became the FCC? Did they informally talk to them? Was this part of the process?
Yes. As in, yes, all of those things. It was pretty good. There'd be, trips, the reporters would go to, for example, the U.S. Navy had a gunboat deployed in the Yangtze, and they would invite them there and talk about their, I'm thinking of 1940 more than 1941. There would be that kind of, official visit where they say, come over for lunch and we'll talk about what the status of where we're at is. There would be, whenever there was a visiting diplomat, maybe there was at one point in the summer of 1941 when 3 American generals, actually Harold George, who was eventually killed with Mel, him and Claire Chennault, who ended up leading the Flying Tigers, and can't remember at the time the name of the third general, but they were traveling around China to review China's air resistance of Japanese, and of course, to study the Japanese bombing and their techniques and the planes and whatnot. And so the reporters were given some access to them for that tour. I feel like in some of Mel's dispatches, that's where it starts to get a little limited, but also because the Japanese are clearly following the reporters around. That's actually, you can kind of tell where the generals are by where there are bombing raids, because the next day there'll be some set of bombing raids. There was that kind of, communication. They would have access, the Guomindang, they would have some controlled access and some, informal access, but then sometimes it would be that situation of direct access that a lower level official will then alter. And then, of course, there was a certain amount of that politicking of who's provided an invitation to a particular event. For example, I don't know if you guys noticed those pictures that went through of the Soong sisters. Mel was one of the ones, partially, I think, because of his role working with XGOY, invited to photograph them on this. It was their reunion tour as sisters for the first time in 1940. In fact, it was essentially 85 years ago, like this month.
And one of those photographs is in the exhibition downstairs.
Yeah, precisely. And that's only because they said, hey, they're going to be here. Also, we'd like them to do a joint broadcast. And Mel, you get to be the one to host them and introduce them to the United States. Unfortunately, that broadcast was jammed, poorly reproduced, and never has I don't have a good original of it, so I can't hear it. But there'd be that kind of thing because he'd impressed them and made friends with them and showed them that he was a hard worker. But there's, there would also be regular contacts with whoever the communist officials were here. And I think it's in the same memo. It may not be that same memo, but at least the same report, or the same report about the memo that Lee read from, where they talk about, the communist, the pair of the representatives of the Communist Party who would come and deliver the weekly newspaper of their efforts to them. There were certainly some restrictions on how they covered and depicted Communist Army victories in the war. In Mel's case, I know that he met with Chao and Lai at least once, but I don't know how frequently, and that wasn't prevented. Trying to think of other examples that I know of. This is one of those subjects that is really, sometimes I have a lot of difficulty speaking of, not this particular question, but Mel as a whole, because I've weirdly had access to so much information that the filtering is really difficult.
Yeah. Thank you. Further questions? Surprisingly none. Okay, great. Gentleman over there.
Do you still go to Chongqing now?
So I went to Chungking once in 2015. So I'm not based here. I'm based in the West Coast, in Portland, Oregon, in the U.S. And so getting anywhere over here is difficult for the many reasons it might be difficult. Not the least of which is the fact that, I'm a parent of a 5-year-old, and I have, I'm a freelancer and an author and all that. The resources are hard. But I did go as I prepared my first book about Mel, somewhat informally, but I was able to see many of the spaces where he was, the location of the press hostel, which now has some residential towers built on it. I'm not sure how familiar some of you are with Chongqing, but there's a lot of air raid shelters that have been turned into things like restaurants and shops and whatnot. And what I'm pretty sure is was the press hostels, because the press had their own shelter, and that was one thing about the difference between the staff and the reporters. Sometimes the staff weren't allowed to use the shelter that the press hostel, the bomb shelter. They would have to go to one of the municipal shelters. So I do know that was an issue of concern. But so some of those shelters are still there. And that would be the case too in say diplomatic consular offices and things like that, embassies. Every sort of official organization would have its own shelter too. It's funny, I've never been a China reporter or someone who was academically focused on China, so this was all new to me. The whole country was new to me in the sense of its importance because of this family connection. Although and it's disappointing because You know, I grew up in the United States, never told about this war and this portion of the war in the history. But the reality is, I don't think people were told about it at the time that much. I don't know if that really answers your question, but yes, I've been there once. I would like to go back.
I would say you did answer the question with a lot of extra color, which was very much welcome.
There.
Thank you.
I could just say that we went there at the end of last year. It was a very interesting place, and I noticed through the house we visited belonged to General Stilwell.
Oh, of course. Yeah, that house is. Yeah, I know this house you're speaking of, and the museum up there. And of course, Stilwell was sort of after Mel's time because you know, I think he arrived in 1943, if I'm not mistaken. But
any further questions for Bill? Seeing none, I'm going to ask. Oh, thank you, Jen. Carsten.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
Thank
Just
you.
wanted to take the opportunity to have you confirm the actual inauguration date of the FCC as you found it documented.
Yeah, very clearly May 18th, 1943. So you're coming up on the anniversary.
So mugs and tote bags and other things available for purchase downstairs are correct, 1943. Thank you for confirming that. I'm going to ask a final question, Bill. I've editorialized quite a bit during this talk on how some things that I see them are similar between the press hostel and the early days of the FCC then and the FCC now. You obviously have been immersed in this history, in these original records for the better part of a decade. And you've spent the last 24 hours immersed in the FCC. I think you had breakfast, lunch, and drinks here yesterday. What do you see as the differences between, you know, the early days of the press hostel and the FCC and the FCC Hong Kong as it is today? What are the differences? What are the similarities?
Well, I mean, the differences are the role I think that the FCC seems to play more broadly in the community here in Hong Kong. The fact that people who are coming through are people from all sorts of industries. You know, in the restaurant I'm seeing, you know, people who do all sorts of jobs. You know, the fact that it seems to be a cult. You know, I had lunch yesterday, just some random restaurant, and someone who shared the table with me obviously was familiar with it. So there's that sense that it's. I guess the difference mainly is it being a bigger institution in the community here and just a part of the community, both for better or worse in the sense that, you know, it's more than just a place where journalists hang out and work. The similarities, though, are that it provides still, it's very clear that it provides that sort of dynamic, spontaneous exchange of ideas and of expertise and of connection that you only get in these third places that you experience, in these places where people are invited not just to work, but to connect more informally, and therefore, I think, to develop an understanding among one another and to develop a way to communicate and to help better the way that, you know, I believe very strongly in the role of journalists as sort of translators on many levels, whether it's translators of language or translators of expertise or knowledge. And I think that translation effort is developed in these places where people are connecting and sharing their knowledge and learning with one another. That clearly was happening. I mean, from a very practical standpoint, in Mel's case, for example, and having looked at his letters and having looked at his photos, I watched his expertise grow, and his understanding and the depth of his knowledge and his professionalism and his maturity very fast in those years that I looked at of his life. Much of that is because of the people he met and knew at the press hostel. I can't speak to people's improvements over the years. They come through these walls, but it's clear that everyone I've met cares very much about journalism and that it's done well and done effectively and done without interference. Whether they're able to accomplish that or not is up for them to decide, but it's clear that that is their priority here. And I respect that, and I think it's only natural that the club would have evolved to these other roles. And so I don't know, I'm pretty impressed, and it seems like a natural outgrowth of what I've been studying for these. In fact, I was telling my mom something the other day, and I was like, okay, well, I saw something that was funny or something on the way up here. I said, on my way up to the press club, or the press hostel. I said that 3 or 4 times when I was telling her something, when I was going to send a text message. Oh yeah, I saw this cool sign outside of the press hostel. Oh wait, no, So I've internalized this place as that continuation, and I think that's probably a good sign.
Yeah, thank you for that. Bill's book, A Danger Shared, is available for sale over there by the exit. Bill's also been kind enough to share some original materials as well as some copied materials from his primary research for us to flick through. Do take a look and spend some time if you're able to. If you've enjoyed this talk and you're not a member of the FCC, we are currently open to membership applications. And as Bill spoke to, we are open not just to journalists, but to non-journalists as well. So do speak to myself, Jennifer Jett, Barbara, or anyone else, or our general manager, David, other board member, Liu Kim Ming, about membership if you're not a member. But I want to join all of you in expressing my sincere thanks for such an informative, entertaining, and enjoyable historical lesson from Mr. Bill Lascher.
Thank you all for having me.